Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, ISIS militants have attacked General Haftar's forces, killing 9. Libyan army says that 200 people have been killed in the recent wave of fighting. But that's not just all. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, since the month-long battle started between the internationally recognized government of Tripoli and General Haftar's forces in East Libya, 55,000 people have been displaced. Libyan Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj warns of a huge illegal migrant crisis at the brink of the Libyan conflict. Some 800,000 illegal migrants are temporarily on Libyan ground, and United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees estimates a further 230,000 internally displaced Libyans and registered refugees and asylum seekers in Libya are ready to flee the country as this conflict goes on. So what does it mean for not just the regional states, but also for Europe? Not only about the migrants trying to flee from Libya itself, but those trapped in detention centers inside Libya. We'll find out when we speak to our guests. We have with us Mr. Chris Stevens, journalist, joining us from London. And also we have Mr. Fawzi Bouketf, former ambassador of Libya. Welcome to Newswire. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Fawzi. The current situation, especially, let's talk a little about ISIS's presence being known. General Haftar had used finishing the extremist presence in Libya as one of his battle cries. What do you think about this attack that has just been carried out a few days ago?
Well, the point goes back to the time where the Misratis and the Libyans fought against Daesh in Sirte. Those who flew the area, they went down to the south. And they have been actually resting on the desert, and they're moving easily, and they have flexibility in the area. So they can attack anywhere they want, especially if we know that the AFRICOM are not targeting Daesh as much as they're targeting Qaeda. Okay? So Daesh, they don't feel that they are suppressed, or they have no pressure on them on the area. So they move easily, especially in the area between Shuwairif and Sabha. So especially their more presentation is in Fogha near Brakshati. So this area in the middle of the country, it's their area. They almost can move in it easily, and they have a high flexibility in the area. Besides, they can make deals, like the deal they make with the commanders in the east when they were fighting in Benghazi. They made a deal to come out of Benghazi when the war was almost to finish, and they went to the south. I mean, the area is there for them. And when General Haftar said that he was moving with his group of armies toward the south, actually, he passed by. He didn't attack them. He didn't take any action against them. Right. So we know that they are there, and their movability and their flexibility is easy.
Right. Let me bring you into this question, Mr. Chris. What do you make of ISIS's presence now in this conflict that has already been going on between the UN-recognized government and Haftar's forces?
Well, the ISIS really benefits from the war, because while Libyans are fighting each other, ISIS used the opportunity to consolidate and regroup. So they are sort of attacking in opportunity, and they stay in the southern desert because the armed forces of Libya are busy fighting each other for Tripoli. And I think that's the concern among Libyans, especially, that the more this war goes on, the more ISIS will have a chance to regroup and find new ways of attacking.
Is this ISIS also trying to carry out revenge against Haftar? He is known for chasing out extremist groups from Libya?
Well, ISIS attack both sides, actually, because they don't like Haftar, but they also don't like their recognized government. So, for instance, one of the most devastating attacks last year was on the National Oil Corporation. And I think ISIS, they don't want Haftar or the government. They want to cause a sort of chaotic situation where they would then hope to take power themselves.
So what do you fear of the situation now evolving in Libya, especially with UN again, time and again, calling for a ceasefire there, but both forces continuing head-to-head and the death count continuing to rise?
Yeah, well, yes, as you say, fear is the word, because I think the UN peace process is more or less dead. I think the battle for Tripoli is likely to go on, and as you said, and as the ambassador said, I think that the more chaos and the more uncertainty there is, the more chance there is for ISIS to exploit this.
Right. And Mr. Fawzi, there's also another concern of a migration crisis ready to take over. I mean, there are various reports. The UNHCR estimates not only the internally displaced, but those who are fleeing other countries in Africa to the tune of 800,000 illegal migrants. This is something that is a huge concern for Europe, as they can spill over across the border to them.
Well, this is true. As Mr. Chris said, the problem is that there is no fighting this ISIS on the middle. I mean, Haftar moved it to the capital to fight there. So, nobody is concerned with fighting ISIS, even though ISIS is not likable by most of the Libyans. They don't like them, but it's a status quo. They are powered. They are in there on the cities, on the south and the towns, and they are traffickers also. They can move those migrants, toward Europe, and they can make use of them. And they also make deals with the commanders in the areas. So there is a business there. There is a market there. It's not just ISIS is preparing or doing for other countries. It's more than that.
Right. And now I'd like to bring in Dr. Younis Lahwej, the lecturer in politics and international relations of the Middle East University of Reading. Welcome to the show, Dr. Younis. There is a growing concern of a migrant crisis taking place in Libya. UNICEF has voiced its concern for over 1,000 minors that are among 3,000 migrants held in Libyan detention centers. What could be the possible future of those stuck in detention centers, especially children, as this conflict continues?
Criminals and the ISIS and other groups taking advantage of the situation because lack of security, lack of government and the state. So this is the way it's going on for a long time, and this center actually is all around the country, from the south up to the north, where Tripoli and so forth. And this is actually is a financial support for these groups. So they need to do that. And unfortunately, even the international community, they are not doing anything because partially some of them, they are really cooperating with these groups to exploit this crisis. I mean, and it's going to be exploited further, especially with the battle for Tripoli today, because there's some militias using these migrants to fight with them against the army, and because there is a financial support, financial means actually they have. I mean, these groups, the criminals and so forth, they have financial means to get these migrants. And the migrants flow is, as I said, I mean, it's even before 2011, but was controlled by the state. Mm-hmm. And Libya was almost a stable state. They used to work and they used to have certain rights, but now they used as actually means for other things.
And the Libyan Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj has warned actually in an interview, international news network, saying that if this conflict continues, these 800,000 illegal migrants, some of whom are actually terrorists and criminals, would spill over into Europe.
Actually, in the contrary. I mean, the Italian actually thinking that this battle for Tripoli reduced the flow of immigration to Europe. They still actually in Libya, but as I said, I mean, they are, yes, some of them, they are from ISIS, some others, criminals and so forth. But actually now they are being used in this war, and this is the irony of it. And as you said, I mean, there's some children as well fighting in, along the militias. So Fawzi Sarraj, actually, when he stated that, of course, I mean, because he's responsible, he's the government, because this is where the flow of immigration comes from the south to Tripoli. So mostly they are in Tripoli or around Tripoli areas. And I know for sure this line of movement of these immigrants from Niger, Chad, and going to Salpan, they have certain routes, which is going all the way from the Midland and going over to the north. So, I mean, there's lots of, there's a danger and there's a humanitarian, situation where they don't have any means to live as a human inside these camps. Right. But again, these camps actually, it's controlled by these militias. So Fawzi Sarraj is accountable for, allowing these militias to using this case. And even the international community, as I said, Italy in particular, I mean, they have certain news that they were cooperating with certain warlords, who's running and controlling these sort of camps.
Right. And Mr. Fawzi, that's what essentially the militias are known for, not having any loyalty to any party. It's very hard to even be able to determine whose side they would be on. Are they that easy to be bought by?
Well, I think the point of militias is not easy to answer because the militias, and especially the ones who are revolutionaries, and they came out of the 2011 revolution, they have not been actually received by the number of governments that they came in Libya. And this is the problem still arising. But nowadays, when General Haftar attacked Tripoli, they all get together and they all now saying we are under the Mr. Sarraj, the President Sarraj influence and control. And so it's a point of change. It's a good point that, now you can make out of them a former arms, okay? But the point of the migrants, the government of Libya in the West, the recognized government, actually they nominated a number of companies that to provide food and shelter for the. But it is, we are paying something for those people who it's a human case, it's a humanitarian case, Actually, they are coming to leave to Europe, not to stay in Libya. And when the fight arises, it's only the Libyans. It's the only place that in the capital that can support them.
Right. And also there's a big question of what the external forces are doing besides their own incentives within this conflict. The US took a huge U-turn, Chris. Earlier on, they had been with Russia in opposing British moves for calling for a ceasefire through the UN last month. And now we've seen President Trump conversing with General Haftar. How do you see that relation progressing?
Yes, I think Trump's support for Haftar has sort of increased the international tensions. And I think that's one of the problems the UN has, that not all the outside states see things the same way. That France is also supporting Haftar and Russia to an extent. So the UN is trying to get a consensus, not just in Libya, but among outside states, that the outside states are split. So that means every time the UN proposes, for instance, a ceasefire, it can't get all the members to agree, even on a statement. And I think this is part of the reason why the Libya war continues, because, again, there's no unity either in the country or outside the country.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's also a big concern about the effect it's having on the regional countries. Right next door, Tunisia is being affected by what is happening in Libya, Chris?
Yeah, there is. Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt are all, concerned that this thing will spill over their borders. And there are some negotiations between the three, between Algiers, Tunis, and Cairo, trying to find a way out, a way of calming things down. But again, they're stuck with the same problem, that the Libyans are not united and the UN is not united. So when the regional powers talk, they are again finding there's no consensus for any one solution.
Right. And Dr. Younis, there's also a big concern about when the Libyan government actually hides the actual number of people being affected or civilians being killed in this conflict.
Yes, actually, yeah. I mean, the civilians are suffering on a daily basis. I'm talking about the Libyan civilians and others who's living there as well. So, I mean, either daily, needs, it's not there. I mean, they don't have much money. The prices is very high. Now Ramadan is starting. So all of this is affecting, and yesterday you saw probably some sort of demonstration in front of one of the banks in the middle of Tripoli and shouting slogans and others against, the government, because they are not really be able to draw about almost 50 pounds, equally to pounds in terms of their salaries. So yeah, I mean, there is daily suffering, especially now with the security and with the war in Tripoli, because Tripoli is the most populated area, as you know, probably 2/3 of the Libyan population are living there. So yeah, I mean, the civilian situation is really it's unbelievable, and you can't really be unspoken about it, because no one actually in the international community as well talking about the situation in Libya. They always concerned about other things, which is to do with the ISIS, to do with the immigration, to do with their own differences regarding oil and other things. So
we're looking at a situation that is not just affecting the region itself; it's affecting it's affecting Europe closely, as we just talked about the migrant crisis, and now also seeing ISIS once again finding an opportunity to raise its ugly head. Where do you see this, Dr. Younis, heading, and what is the international community not taking action on that needs imperative attention?
Yeah, again, ISIS, as you know, it's lost in terms of territory. I mean, they lost their bases in Tripoli and in Syria and Iraq, and this is actually the ideal place for them, because the country is really divided, as your colleague said, internally and internationally, regionally as well. The environment is quite important for them, because most ISIS, people who's working with ISIS or joining ISIS are from the Sahel area, Niger, Chad, Mali, plus, the Tunisian, Nigerians, all these terrorists, they found a safe haven there, because the terrain is difficult. There's no central government, there's no security, and the army can control it. This is, plus you have the oil, which is, again, they lost it in Syria, and now they can really, sort of getting some sort of financial, means to carry on their business. Plus the immigration, because immigration is lucrative actually trade right now. I mean, there's so much money involved in transferring these Africans and the Sahelian people from south until north. So ISIS, I think, although there is no, population, I mean, the local population, they're not supporting them. So, but they can operate outside the cities. They commit crimes before. Mm-hmm. They lost Sirte, of course, which is important in that time. And now the south is actually the ideal place. Mm-hmm. And the international community, I mean, you wonder sometimes, where's the international community? How can be terrorists, going all the way from Syria, transferring to Libya? I mean, by which means? Is it by airplanes? Is it by sea? And who's responsible? Who's really monitoring it? And we know the AFRICOM, forces, they target certain members of ISIS in the past in Libya. I mean,
that's a really good point there, Dr. Younis. Mr. Fawzi, let me come to you over here about who exactly is it that is allowing or mediating or helping in the movement of ISIS. And of course, we understand it's a fluid organization, it's an ideology that has supporters all around the world. But having seen this conflict deteriorate day after day, it is just, isn't it creating an opportunity for them appearing here with absolutely no accountability?
Well, I agree, okay? It is the point that the absence of the state, the fighting that arising, the attacking of the capital, that makes a space, because ISIS can move in the vacuum of the government. As long as there is instability, they will move in, because it's easy. The population are small, The area is very large. The communication in the desert with others is easy. The deal is available always for them on the. It's a market. There are many activities can be done, and they can also ignite their life always. So it is a problem that the internationals have to understand that we have to stop the war. We have to stop, the fake media about that there is an army. Libya has no army now. We need to build an army. We need to build something that's sustainable, that is really can communicate and can deal with others, internationals. Otherwise, we are in the vacuum, and this is why the problem will persist, and it will continue. And I don't know how much it will arise. What's coming next? We don't know. As long as the war will continue in Tripoli,
right,
there is other contingency could happen. And there are others could come in the scene and, enlarge the conflict on the area. And
right,
this is why we need a stand. We need a real stand.
We need a real stand, and also a presence of an international community member, someone who does have a say, but unfortunately it's working on the opposite. It's almost as if it's working against bringing peace here. Because General Haftar, Chris, recently said that we have the backing of the US, we have President Trump on our side. And that doesn't at all help in a situation where the Libyan army is saying, let's have a ceasefire during Ramzan. And on the other hand, General Haftar is saying that urging his fighters to fight even more in this holy month.
I mean, for instance, there are two Libyan armies. Haftar's army is called the Libyan Army, and then the forces defending Tripoli are also called the Libyan Army. So, each army says that it's the proper army, and each government says, well, the solution to peace is for us to win the war. As your speakers are saying, that there's no real mediation because there's no one is in a position to mediate. I mean, the most powers are either on one side or the other.
So why do you think Trump had that connection with General Haftar? What made him make that U-turn? Why is he kind of indicating that he backs Haftar here?
Well, for sure, I don't know what Trump was thinking, but his published reasoning has been the same as the French, that they see they see Haftar as a bulwark against extremists, and they think that if Haftar runs the country, he'll be able to combat extremist forces such as ISIS. I mean, that's their point of view, but it's not a point of view that everybody would share.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, Mr. Fawzi, what do you think? Agree with Chris's idea of this, that backing General Haftar is basically having someone against the extremists in Libya?
The stand and the support of Haftar is not helping the Libyans. Okay, now if there is no a real international stand to solve the problem or to prevent other regional and non-regional support to the war, we will continue to have this problem. There is no way Haftar can do anything in the area. Haftar, when he moved with the LNA to the south, actually he made more problems than he solved the problems there.
Right. So
it was something temporarily, but when he moved, because we know the army or the people, the fighters on the east are even 1/3 of the Libyans, less than 1/3, maybe a quarter of the Libyans. So they cannot, control this vast area of the desert.
Right.
There's no way.
There's no way he could have that. So, Younis, your remarks on, as this stalemate continues in Libya between the government of national accord and Haftar's forces, what do you see the endorsement of Trump doing to this conflict?
Trump actually is always, as you have to be, looking at the American foreign policy in general. I mean, the American principle as well, and theoretically, as they always go with realism. And if there's a reality on the ground, they go for it. So now they saw Haftar he actually dominated the east. I wouldn't say his forces, the Libyan army, what the Libyans, almost they call it, controlled the south, although not by war, but actually by agreement with certain militias they incorporated within the LA, and now they move towards the Tripoli area. So on the ground, they judged that is the only man. He could do that. He could, form sort of consensus among the Libyans. He could really bring back stability. Of course, for the Americans, the main concern is ISIS, and fighting ISIS or fighting terrorism in general, it was really,
their priority right now. Okay.
And their priority right now, although it's not really.
Okay, thank you much, Dr. Younis and Mr. Fawzi and Mr. Chris for your valuable time and insight here on Newswire. We've come to the end of this segment. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. A ceasefire has finally been reached between Gaza and Israel after the worst fighting scenes since November last year. Violence spiraled over the weekend after Israel and Islamic Jihad traded fire, killing 4, including 2 protesters on Friday. Over the next 2 days, hundreds of rockets were launched into Israel from Gaza, killing 4 Israelis. IDF pounded the besieged enclave in response with airstrikes and artillery, killing 25 Palestinians, including 2 pregnant women and a 14-month-old baby girl. Now, ceasefire was announced on the first day of the holy month of Ramzan, while there are bomb shelters and the Iron Dome protecting the Israelis from attacks. The residents of Gaza are in a congested, tight space, overcrowded, and with 0 shelters to protect them at times of intense aerial firing and military fire. So what is the future of the Gaza Strip, as well as pontificating over what trend is it going to take now that Netanyahu is back in the office? What is the plight going to be of these Gazan people? So I'd like to welcome my guests here. We have with us Mr. CJ Werleman. He's an analyst. And also we have Mr. Muslim Imran, an analyst joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Muslim Imran. Now that there is a ceasefire in effect since early morning, the Islamic Jihad is saying in various reports that Israel has agreed to some of its stipulations, one of which include easing the blockade on Gaza. What can you tell us about this agreement?
Well, the Palestinian resistance has expressed its interest in a longer ceasefire, not one that would last 4 days and then Israel would breach it. But Israel is not serious about these ceasefires. Israel wants to have a free hand in Gaza to bombard whenever it wants, to kill civilian protesters mainly, whenever it wants, without Palestinian response. That's why even if they reach a ceasefire agreement now, there are no guarantees that Israel won't breach it again. The Palestinian resistance leaders are currently in Cairo. They were there before the start of the latest Israeli escalation, and that shows that the Palestinian resistance leadership is serious about reaching some sort of a ceasefire deal with the other side. But Israel isn't serious about it. Israel, in fact, is talking about ceasefire now only because it has its Nakba or Independence Day celebrations in a week time, and the international contest Eurovision on the 14th of May. Therefore, the Israeli leadership isn't interested in an international embarrassment. They are talking about a ceasefire now. I don't think they are serious about holding the ceasefire for so long. They have committed heinous war crimes in the latest escalation. Mm-hmm. They killed many innocent children, pregnant mothers, and others, and that's why, as a Palestinian, I don't think Israel will.
It's going to hold on to its end of the deal. Let me ask you then, Mr. Werleman, what is your take on this? There seems to be a pattern here in Gaza that there are escalations and there's a lull when a ceasefire or a deal is struck, and then that too very quickly is broken off. Do you agree with Mr. Muslim here that Israel, as always, will not hold on to its end of the bargain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Israel hasn't held on to its end of the bargain forever. I mean, to be honest, Israel has been shooting and killing Palestinian protesters, unarmed Palestinian protesters, including women, children, journalists, medics, every single day for the last 12 months. It was only after another 24 Palestinian protesters were shot on Thursday and Friday that militants from Islamic Jihad, snipers, fired at Israeli snipers, fired at the very same snipers that have been shooting unarmed Palestinian protesters for the last year. Then the rocket fire came from Israel's side. Israel carried out a drone strike on Hamas militants in Gaza. And from there, Hamas militants and Islamic Jihad fired rockets in retaliation to Israel. Now that context has been lost, and that timeline has been lost when American politicians and the Israel lobby and also media portray what is happening in Gaza at the moment. So no, I don't have any hope that a ceasefire would be held. Israel doesn't do that. Israel has moved its artillery, it's moved its tanks, and moved infantry divisions closer to the Israeli security perimeter, ready for another ground invasion, which I think is, more likely than the next coming month.
That's true. Let me show you what the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, said earlier.
אני הנחיתי הבוקר את צה"ל להמשיך בתקיפות המסיביות נגד גורמי הטרור ברצועת עזה, וכן הנחיתי לעבות את הכוחות סביב רצועת עזה בכוחות שריון, ארטילריה וחי"ר.
A lot of analysts, Mr. Muslim, are commenting on this escalation having been as bad as what led to the war in 2014.
If he carries out a big-scale invasion or attack on Gaza, he would not face international, legal consequences. The Goldstone report, which we all remember, basically attributed many of the war crimes that occurred in the 2008-2009 war to the Israeli military forces, but no international action has been taken. That's why Israel followed suit in 2012 and again in 2014 and committed preposterous war crimes in Gaza. This time around, Netanyahu thinks that if he has to carry out a similar attack on Gaza, then he would do so. He is currently forming a government with the worst of ultra-nationalist right-wing groups in Israel's history. So in order to appease and to please these coalition partners, he will certainly commit more war crimes, and he will certainly try to show that he's strict with the Palestinians. But it never worked. All these Israeli
No, there's something, Mr. Werleman, that Mr. Muslim said here, that Israel will never be held accountable for its actions. And why would it, when one of the superpowers of the world, the US, continues to support him? And again, at this moment, when this conflict was escalating, President Trump came out with a tweet supporting Israel's actions, saying it was their right to defend themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not just President Trump, and it's not just the Republican Party that he represents. Support for Israel's war crimes in Gaza enjoys bipartisan support in the United States. We saw today, in the last 24 hours, politicians, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, including a number of high-profile Democratic Party senators and congressmen, echo the same sort of propaganda and nonsense put the Israel lobby, almost mirroring the AIPAC's tweet word for word, and therefore confusing Americans about what's really happening, and which enables when the American public is not clued into what's really happening there in Gaza, then America has the political will or the political power to prevent any further investigation or any further action against Israel, whether that be sanctions or whether the condemnation within the UN.
Right. And Mr. Muslim, let me read what Trump said. To the Gazan people, these terrorist acts against Israel will bring you nothing but more misery. End the violence and work towards peace. It can happen. What do you make of his tweet, considering the 12-year blockade has completely ruined the economy of Gaza, this tiny strip of land where 2 million people are congested in what foreign leaders have openly said is an open-air prison?
Trump's statements show his utter ignorance of what is happening in Gaza. He's trying to please the Israeli lobby in the U.S. Without any regard to international law, to international humanitarian law, or the situation per se. His foreign secretary has also made similar ridiculous statements, which show that they are unaware of what's going on the ground. Israel has been besieging Gaza for 13 years. The Palestinians have not been besieging themselves in Gaza. Israel has been besieging the Gaza Strip for 13 years, denying basic necessities, basic amenities. Water is being denied from entering Gaza. Israel is robbing Palestinian underground water. Electricity supply is very low. At best, it can reach 4 hours a day because Israel has continuously bombarded the power plants in Gaza. It's one of the biggest open-air prisons in the world. So the U.S. Stand is very biased, and we're not looking up to the U.S. for solutions in this context. I would say our hopes are on the rest of the international community, on the OIC member states. They have to take a stand. So far, very few Arab and Muslim nations have even made statements about what's going on in Gaza. I understand that there is huge international pressure on them, but that's not a justification. The Palestinians in Gaza are sacrificing everything they have. And the minimum that they expect from their fellow brothers and sisters all over the world is to stand by their struggle.
One of the statements that came out from the IDF was, with a video that was released, that a car that was targeted by a drone and the driver killed was actually a person who was in charge of transferring money from Iranian sources to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, that the IDF released this, saying that he was Hamid Ahmed Khudari, along with many other videos released in the past few days claiming who they attacked. What do you make of this statement by the IDF?
Well, the 14-month-old child was not transferring any money to anybody. The 2 pregnant women who were bombarded, the 4 families who were wiped out, were not transferring any money to anybody. And it does make no sense that the Palestinians are being targeted for helping their own self-defense. Israel receives an annual American military aid of $4 billion. In the same logic, Palestinians have the right, the Palestinian resistance in Gaza has the right to bombard whoever transfers that money to the Israeli banks and to the Israeli war machines. It is ridiculous. Israel continues to commit war crimes and brings all these pretexts to cover its war crimes. The hundreds of Palestinians who were murdered in the Great Return marches were not transferring any money. They were not carrying any weapons.
And it's also interesting, Mr. Muslim, how when this video surfaced of the drone strike on this car, it was very precise, it was very accurate. The periphery damage was not as much. And at the same time, they don't have an explanation for how they mistakenly attacked these families where pregnant women were sitting with children in their laps.
Israeli army has some of the most sophisticated state-of-the-art weaponry. They use it against civilians. This has been documented by all kinds of international organizations. It was documented on several occasions by Israeli human rights groups themselves. Everyone in the world knows that Israel is a war criminal regime, but it's a matter of willingness on behalf of the international community to take action. Everyone knows that Israeli leadership is representing a Nazi-like political ideology, but no one takes action against their authorities because of the cover they receive from the superpower. Right. So the Palestinians are basically defending their basic rights of living and existence. There are no problems in people defending themselves. It's enshrined in international conventions. The problem is in occupation. When Israel wants to perpetuate its occupation, it commits more war crimes in order to maintain its system of occupation. That will never continue for so long.
Right. So, Mr. Werleman, there's also this side of the debate where it is believed by some analysts that Hamas and Israel actually need each other. They're codependent on each other for their own sort of incentives of why they dominate the region. Do you agree with that analysis?
The analysis is, especially when you can consider the fact that Hamas is the love child was birthed by the Israeli or the Israeli intelligence. Israel helped foment and extreme Islamic groups to offset the influence, the strength of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 1970s, 1980s. Were not for Israel, Hamas wouldn't exist. Hamas gives Israel a fig leaf to carry out repressive and brutal security policies against the Palestinian people.
Okay.
So, yeah, absolutely agree with that analysis.
Right. So, Mr. Muslim, what do you agree with this? What Mr. Werleman just said?
I certainly don't agree with any kind of formula that equates between the occupation and the occupied. The Israeli government, the Israeli regime is sponsored by the superpower to continue an occupation not only in Palestine but also in the Golan Heights and in some parts of southern Lebanon. The Palestinians, the Syrians and Lebanese are defending their own basic rights. It makes no sense to equate between the two of them. Yes, Israel receives a response from the Palestinian resistance groups whenever it bombards Gaza, but that does not mean that the projectiles that the Palestinians fire from Gaza are equivalent to the war machine that Israel uses. The F-16s, the Apaches, the very sophisticated state-of-the-art Israeli weaponry, which kill hundreds of Palestinians on few days.
But would you agree to the point? Would you agree to the point that in itself, the Palestinian Authority, the political factions in itself, have so many differences that it creates a perfect opportunity for Israelis to take advantage of that?
We have a very dysfunctional Palestinian political system, and that's a different story. Yes, the Palestinian political system is a failed system. It needs reform, but I won't blame one side or another. Mm-hmm. The system has been divided because of external pressure, because of Israeli and American pressure on the system. Okay. We all remember that Israel continues to rob the Palestinian Authority of its tax money. The Americans rejected the results of the 2006 parliamentary elections. So the current Palestinian division is an engineered division which is created by the external powers, not by the Palestinians themselves.
Okay,
the Palestinians
Mr. Muslim, I'm sorry, we'll have to right there. We've run out of time. But thank you so much for your insight and your valuable opinion. Also, thank you to Mr. CJ Werleman for taking part here on Newswire. And with this, we've come to the end of the show. We will see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.